My name is Silas Pemberton. I was born in 1841, Madison County, Kentucky. That makes me. Let me see, 91 years old now, sitting here talking to you in the spring of 1932. Feels strange, putting a number to all those years. I tell people I'm a farmer, always have been, but that word means something different now than it did when I was coming up. Back then, before the war, my daddy Amos had about 60 acres of good bottomland along the Kentucky River. Tobacco mostly, some corn. We weren't rich, but we weren't scratching dirt either. Had 4 horses, about a dozen head of cattle, and my mother Prudence kept chickens that laid eggs so orange you'd think the yolks were painted. Then the war came, 1861. I was 20 years old when Daddy joined up with the 8th Kentucky Infantry. He said it wouldn't last 6 months. Said he'd be home before the corn got high. I remember standing in the yard, watching him ride off with Harlan Kimball, our neighbor from the next property over. Harlan was younger, maybe 18, 19. Had this way of laughing that made everybody around him smile, even when nothing was particularly funny. Daddy didn't come home in 6 months. He came home in a pine box 2 years later, spring of 1863. Shiloh, they told us. I don't know much more than that. Mama wouldn't talk about it, just put his letters in a wooden box and kept them under her bed until the day she died. The farm went to pieces while I tried to keep it going. War came through Kentucky like a fever. First one side, then the other. Taking horses, taking food, taking anything that wasn't nailed down, and some things that were. By 1865, when Lee surrendered, we had maybe 10 acres left worth planting, and I owed money to 3 different men in town. I was 24 years old and felt like I'd already lived a whole lifetime. That's when Mama said we were leaving. Just like that, over breakfast one morning in June. We're going west. Silas, there's nothing left for us here but debts and ghosts. She'd been talking to Reverend Cyrus Threadgill, who was organizing a wagon train to Oregon Territory. Threadgill was one of these men who could talk paint off a barn, convince you the sun would be shining even while rain was falling on your head. He painted pictures of land so rich you could stick a fence post in the ground and it'd sprout leaves. Free land, he said. Homestead Act. 160 acres for any man willing to work it. Harlan Kimball came back from the war, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and whatever it was that made him laugh before, he signed on with us. So did about 15 other families from the county, all of us looking for the same thing, I suppose. A chance to start over. A place where the dirt wasn't soaked with blood and memory. We left Madison County on the 4th of August, 1865. I never went back. The trail west wasn't one thing. It was 1,000 small miseries strung together, like beads on a string, each one wearing you down a little more, until you couldn't remember what it felt like to sleep in a bed that didn't move, eat food that didn't taste like dust. We followed the Platte River through Nebraska Territory, and I remember thinking the land was so flat and empty, it made you feel like you could see the curve of the earth itself. The grass went on forever, this pale green ocean that rolled in the wind, and the sky was so big it felt like it might swallow you whole if you stared at it too long. We walked beside our wagons most days to spare the oxen, and by the end of each day, my feet felt like they'd been beaten with hammers. Mama never complained, not once, just kept walking with her bonnet pulled low and her jaw set in that way she had when she'd made up her mind about something. There was a young man in our train, Leander Cruz, though everybody called him Lee. He was maybe 22, 23 years old, came from somewhere down in Tennessee. Lee had this restless energy about him, always walking ahead of the wagons, always wanting to see what was over the next rise. He'd fought with the Union, which made some of the Kentucky folks suspicious of him at first, but he had an easy way about him that made it hard to stay angry. We got to be friends on the trail, him and me. He'd tell stories around the fire at night about places he wanted to see. California and the gold fields, maybe down to Mexico. Silas, he'd say, we're living in the best time there ever was for a man who wants to move around, see the whole world. I wasn't so sure about that, but I liked listening to him talk. About 3 weeks into the journey, we saw our first Indians. Cheyenne, Reverend Threadgill said, though I don't know how he could tell. There were maybe a dozen of them on a ridge about half a mile off, just sitting on their horses watching us pass. Everybody in the train got real quiet, and I saw men checking their rifles even though Threadgill kept saying, no shooting, we're just passing through their land, peaceful like. The Cheyenne never came closer, just watched us for maybe an hour, and then disappeared over the ridge. A few days later, 3 of them rode into camp in the evening. One of them, older fellow with a scar across his cheek and 2 eagle feathers in his hair, he spoke some English. Called himself Broken Pine, though that might have been our translation, not his real name. They wanted to trade, and Threadgill spent an hour negotiating over coffee and tobacco and some steel knives. It wasn't friendly exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. Just business between strangers who happened to be in the same place at the same time. The real enemy on the trail wasn't Indians or bandits, or any of the things that dime novels talk about. It was cholera. We lost our first person to it in late August, a man named Garrett from one of the Tennessee families. He was fine at breakfast, complaining about stomach pains by noon, and dead before the sun went down. After that, it moved through the train like wildfire. We lost 6 people in 10 days, including a woman named Minerva Holcomb's husband. Minerva was maybe 25, 26 years old, had been married less than a year when her husband Thomas took sick. I remember her sitting beside his grave after we buried him, just sitting there in the grass, not crying, not moving, just staring at the mound of dirt like she was trying to memorize it. Mama went and sat with her for a while. Didn't say anything, just sat there. Sometimes there's nothing to say. We reached Wyoming Territory in September of 1865, and that's where we stopped. Not Oregon like we'd planned, but close enough for those of us who were tired of moving. The land there was different from Kentucky, harder somehow, all sagebrush and rocky soil, but there was water from the mountain runoff and grass for cattle, and Threadgill said a man could make it work if he was willing to put his back into it. Me and Mama and Harlan Kimball claimed adjoining parcels about 10 miles from what would eventually become the town of Rawlins, though back then it was just a water stop for the stage line. Lee Cruz settled nearby too, said he'd try ranching for a while before moving on to wherever he was going next. That first winter damn near killed us all. I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I mean the cold came down out of the mountains in November and didn't let up until March, and there were days when I thought we'd freeze to death in our own beds. We'd built a cabin, me and Harlan, working from dawn to dark for 6 weeks straight, but it was rough work, and the wind found every crack and gap in the logs. Mama would stuff rags in the worst spots, and we'd huddle near the stove burning buffalo chips because we didn't have enough wood. Lost half our cattle that winter, found them frozen stiff in the draws come spring. But we made it through. That's what you did back then. You made it through, or you didn't. And if you didn't, well, somebody else would claim your land and make something of it. By 1867, we had things running pretty well, or at least well enough that I could start thinking about something other than just surviving until spring. The cattle business was starting to take shape in Wyoming, with the big outfits driving herds up from Texas to fatten on the northern grass before shipping them east on the new railroad lines. Me and Harlan had about 40 head by then, not much compared to the big ranchers, but it was ours, and we built it for nothing. I hired a man named Talmadge Fisk to help us. Everybody called him Tally, an older fellow who'd been working cattle since before I was born. Tally had this weathered face like old leather and hands that were all scars and calluses, and he knew more about handling stock than any man I've ever met. He taught me to read the grass, to know when it was time to move the herd to fresh range, to spot a sick animal before the sickness spread to the others. It was Tally who introduced me properly to Minerva Holcomb. She'd settled about 5 miles from us and was trying to make a go of it on her own, which was about the hardest thing a woman could do back then. She kept chickens and had a vegetable garden that somehow produced food even in that rocky soil, and she took in sewing work from some of the other settlers. I'd seen her around, of course, at the church services when the circuit preacher came through, but I was shy around women, and she seemed like she wanted to be left alone with her grief. But Tally, he had no patience for that kind of foolishness. He said to me one day, "Silas, that woman needs help with her roof before winter comes, and you need someone who can cook something other than beans and hardtack. Seems to me you could help each other out." So I rode over there one afternoon in August of 1868 with my tools and spent 2 days fixing her roof and reinforcing her cabin walls. We didn't talk much while I worked, but on the second evening, she invited me to stay for supper, and we sat at her small table, eating stew and biscuits that were so good I almost cried. We were married that October by Reverend Threadgill. I was 27 years old, and she was 28, and neither of us was looking for romance or poetry, just partnership and companionship, and someone to stand beside when the hard times came. The hard times came in 1872. That winter was worse than anything we'd seen before, worse than anything the old-timers could remember. The snow started in November and just kept coming, 3 feet deep in some places, then 4, then 5. The temperature dropped so low that cattle froze standing up, their breath turning to ice on their muzzles. We lost 200 head that winter, more than half our herd, and there wasn't a damn thing we could do about it except watch them die. I remember walking through the snow one morning in January, it must have been 20 or 30 below zero, and finding a young heifer stuck in a drift. She was still alive, barely, her eyes rolling in terror, and I tried to dig her out, but the snow was frozen hard as concrete. I stayed with her until she died. Don't know why, couldn't do anything for her, but it seemed wrong to let her die alone. When I got back to the cabin, Minerva took one look at me and sat me down by the stove and brought me coffee and didn't ask any questions. She understood. That was the thing about Minerva. She understood things without needing them explained. We came back from that winter, though it took us 5 years to rebuild the herd to where it had been. Our son Osceola was born in 1873, named after a Seminole chief Minerva had read about in a book. Then our daughter Parthenia came along in 1875. Having children changed things, made the ranch feel less like a survival project and more like something permanent we were building for the future. I'd watch Osceola, even when he was just a little thing, and try to imagine what kind of world he'd grow up in, what kind of man he'd become. Hard to picture it back then, hard to see past the daily work of feeding stock and fixing fences and trying to make enough money to pay the few bills we had. The rustlers were a constant problem in those years. Cattle thieves, men who'd steal your stock and rebrand them or drive them across the territorial line into Colorado, or Montana, where nobody knew whose cattle they were. There was a fellow named Dutch Hennigan who ran with a gang of rustlers operating out of the Badlands north of us. They hit our ranch twice, took maybe 30 head total over 2 years. The law was pretty much useless. The nearest marshal was in Cheyenne, 3 days' ride away, and by the time you could get word to him, the stolen cattle were long gone. So we handled it ourselves, the way everybody did back then. A group of us ranchers formed what we called a Stockmen's Association, which was really just a fancy name for a vigilante group. We caught 3 of Dutch's gang in 1876. Caught them red-handed with fresh-branded cattle that clearly weren't theirs. I won't go into details about what happened next, but I'll say it wasn't something I'm proud of, and it's something that still shows up in my dreams sometimes, even now, 50-some years later. Dutch himself got caught by a different group the next year, but instead of hanging him, they gave him a choice: leave the territory forever or face a rope. He left, and I heard later he went straight, became a lawman himself down in New Mexico. Funny how life works sometimes. Judge Thornton Bridges was the political power in our part of Wyoming back then, a man who'd come west after the war, and somehow ended up owning half the county through a combination of smart dealing and what I'd call creative interpretation of the law. He wasn't a bad man exactly, but he wasn't a good one either. He was the kind who'd help you if it served his interests, and turn a blind eye if it didn't. When the railroad came through in 1878, Bridges made sure the spur line ran through land he owned, and suddenly his property was worth 10 times what he'd paid for it. That's how fortunes were made out here, not through hard work necessarily, though that was part of it, but through being in the right place when opportunity knocked, and having the sense or the ruthlessness to grab hold of it. The trouble with Wendell Lattimore started over something so small, it seems almost stupid now, but that's how most violence begins, isn't it? With something small that grows and grows until there's no way to stop it without somebody bleeding. Lattimore had come into Wyoming territory around 1876 or 77 with money from back east, bought up a big spread south of us, and started running sheep. Now, cattle ranchers and sheep men have never gotten along. Something about sheep cropping the grass too close to the ground, ruining it for cattle, or at least that's what the cattlemen say. Personally, I think it was more about pride and territory than grass, but either way, there was bad feeling from the start. Lattimore was one of these educated Eastern men who thought he could come west and tell everybody how things should be done, had books about modern ranching methods and theories about land management, and he made no secret of the fact that he thought the rest of us were backward fools stuck in the old ways. The first real conflict came in the spring of 1879. Lattimore's sheep had drifted onto range that me and several other cattlemen had been using for years. Not legally ours exactly, but there was an understanding, a kind of unwritten agreement about who grazed where. When we tried to talk to Lattimore about it, tried to explain how things worked out here, he pulled out a survey map and showed us that technically, according to the Territorial Land Office, that range was open to whoever got there first. He was right, legally speaking, but law and custom are two different things, and custom said that range was ours. We drove his sheep off, scattered them back toward his property. He filed a complaint with the territorial marshal. The marshal came out, looked around, said there wasn't much he could do about grazing disputes, and suggested we work it out amongst ourselves. So nothing got resolved, and the tension just built up like pressure in a boiler. Lee Cruz was still ranching near us, still talking about leaving someday, but never quite getting around to it. He'd married a woman named Evangeline, a widow from one of the newer settler families, and they had 2 little girls. Lee had settled down some, wasn't quite as restless as he used to be, but he still had that quality of always looking toward the horizon, like there was something out there he was supposed to find. In June of 1880, Lee caught some of Lattimore's shepherds cutting our fence line to let their sheep through. There was an argument, voices raised, and one of the shepherds pulled a gun. Lee was faster. He killed the man, shot him twice in the chest, and the other shepherds ran. It was a clear case of self-defense. The dead man had drawn first, and there were witnesses, but Lattimore didn't see it that way. He swore out a warrant for Lee's arrest, claiming it was murder, and suddenly we had the law involved in a way that made everything more complicated. The new marshal in Rawlins was a man named Declan Rourke, an Irishman who'd been a lawman in Kansas before coming to Wyoming. Rourke was honest. I'll give him that, which was more than you could say for a lot of frontier lawmen. But honest doesn't always mean effective, and it doesn't always mean understanding the way things really work. He arrested Lee and held him in the town jail while they waited for the circuit judge to come through and hear the case. That could take weeks, maybe months. And in the meantime, Lee was locked up, and Lattimore was telling everyone who'd listen that this was exactly the kind of lawless violence that cattlemen brought to the territory, that men like us were standing in the way of civilization and progress. Some people listened to him. The territory was changing. New people coming in who didn't understand the old ways, who thought law written in a book was more important than the code men had lived by for 20 years. We got lie out before the judge arrived, but not through legal means. A group of us went to the jail one night. About 15 men I'd known for years, good men mostly, family men, and we convinced Marshal Rourke to step aside and hand over the keys. Convinced isn't quite the right word. We had guns, and he didn't have much choice. But we didn't hurt him, and we locked him in one of his own cells, so he could honestly say he'd been overpowered. We took Lee and told him to ride hard for Montana or Idaho, somewhere far enough away that Lattimore's reach wouldn't extend. He didn't want to go, didn't want to leave Evangeline and the girls, but we told him he didn't have a choice, that if he stayed, he'd hang whether he deserved it or not. I remember he looked at me before he rode off, and he said, "Silas, I don't know if I can come back from this." I said, "You will. Give it a year or two for things to cool down. You'll come back." But I was wrong. He never came back. What happened next is the part one have the hardest time talking about, even now, even after all these years. A week after Lee left, 2 of Lattimore's men were found dead on the range, shot from ambush. Nobody knew who did it. There were suspicions but no proof. And suddenly it felt like we were headed toward an all-out range war. Judge Bridges tried to mediate, called a meeting between Lattimore and the Cattlemen's Association, but it went nowhere. Both sides too angry to compromise. Then somebody, I still don't know who, decided to take direct action. They caught one of Lattimore's shepherds, a Mexican fellow named, I think, Vargas, caught him alone with his flock about 10 miles from Lattimore's ranch. They accused him of being involved in rustling, of killing the 2 cowboys, accusations that probably weren't true, but which they convinced themselves were true, or at least true enough. They hanged him from a cottonwood tree and left his body there as a message. I wasn't there when it happened, but I knew the men who were, and I didn't stop them even though I knew what they were planning. And that makes me complicit, makes me guilty of his death, as sure as if I'd put the rope around his neck myself. I've thought about that man, about Vargas, probably once a week for the last 50 years. I don't know if he had a family, don't know if he was a good man or a bad one, don't know anything about him except that he died for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Died because men like me decided that protecting our way of life was more important than his life. Marshal Rourke investigated, interviewed everybody, but nobody talked, and he couldn't prove anything. Lattimore left the territory 6 months later, sold his spread to a cattle operation out of Cheyenne. We'd won, I suppose, if you can call it winning. My son Osceola left for Montana in 1888, said he wanted to see new country, try his hand at mining or logging or whatever work he could find up there. He was 15 years old, tall and strong, and full of the same restless energy Lee Cruz used to have. I tried to talk him into staying, tried to tell him the ranch would be his someday, but he said that was exactly why he needed to go. Needed to find out who he was before he got locked into being a rancher, because that's what his father was. I understood that, even if I didn't like it. We got 3 letters from him that first year, then 2 the second year, then nothing. We never found out what happened. Maybe he died. Maybe he just moved on and started a new life and didn't feel the need to write. Minerva took it hard, waited by the mail rider every week for years, hoping for word. I think part of her died waiting. The 20th century came, and with it changes that happened so fast, it made her head spin. Changes that transformed everything about the way we lived, until the world I'd grown up in felt like something from ancient history, something that might as well have happened 1,000 years ago, instead of just 50. The railroad had already changed things, but then came the telephone lines stretching across the prairie, then automobiles rattling down roads that used to be wagon tracks, then electricity reaching even the remote ranches, bringing light at the flip of a switch where we'd used kerosene lamps for 30 years. My daughter Parthenia married a man named Robert Dockery in 1902, a school teacher who'd come west from Pennsylvania, and they settled in Rawlins, which by then was a real town with brick buildings and a newspaper, and everything you'd expect from civilization. She'd visit the ranch with her children, my grandchildren, and I'd watch these young ones who'd never known anything but the modern world, who thought that milk came from a store, and that traveling 50 miles was something you could do in an afternoon. And I'd realize they had no concept of what it had taken to build all of this, no understanding of the violence and suffering and sheer stubborn endurance that had turned empty prairie into towns and ranches and farms. Minerva got sick in 1917, started having pains in her stomach that wouldn't go away, and by the time we got her to a doctor in Cheyenne, it was too late. Cancer had spread through her insides like wildfire. She died in March of 1919, 2 months after the Great War ended, though the war seemed very far away from us out here, even if we did have young men from Wyoming who went over there and some who didn't come back. I buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch, the same hill where we used to sit on summer evenings and watch the sunset turn the prairie grass gold. After she died, the ranch felt emptier than it ever had before, even emptier than those first hard winters when we were just trying to survive. I kept working it with Tally Fisk, who was getting old like me, but still showed up every morning ready to do what needed doing. But my heart wasn't in it the same way. I leased out most of the grazing land to a bigger outfit and kept just enough cattle to give me something to do, some reason to get out of bed in the morning. I think about Lee Cruz sometimes, wonder what happened to him up there in Montana, if he ever found what he was looking for, or if he died young, like so many men did back then. I kept in touch with his wife Evangeline for years after he left, sent her money when I could, because it seemed like the least I could do, some way to make up for the fact that we'd sent her husband away and he'd never come back. She remarried eventually, moved to Colorado with her new husband and her girls, and we lost touch. That's how it goes, isn't it? People drift in and out of your life, and most of them you never see again, never know how their story ended. I think about that shepherd Vargas, too. Think about him more than I'd like to admit. There's a lot of things I did in my life that I'm proud of. Building this ranch from nothing, raising a family, surviving when survival wasn't guaranteed. But there's things I'm ashamed of, too. Things I can't undo or make right no matter how much time passes. The West I knew is gone now, been gone for years, replaced by something that's maybe better in some ways and definitely worse in others. You can drive from Rawlins to Cheyenne in a few hours now on paved roads. No danger of getting stuck in mud or lost in a blizzard. No fear of rustlers or hostile Indians or any of the things that used to keep you up at night. There's law and order, real law with courts and judges and due process, not just rough justice dispensed by men with guns and strong opinions. That's progress, I suppose. That's civilization. And I'm not so old and stubborn that I can't see the value in it. But something was lost too, something I don't quite have the words to explain. There was a freedom out here in the early days, a sense that a man could make his own way and live by his own rules as long as he was willing to accept the consequences. And that's mostly gone now, replaced by regulations and permits and committees that decide what you can and can't do with your own land. I sit here now in 1932 at 91 years old, looking back across all those years, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of it all. Not sure if the story of my life adds up to anything meaningful, or if I'm just one more old man who happened to be in a certain place at a certain time and did what he had to do to survive. I built a ranch that's still here, still operating even if I don't run it anymore, and I raised a daughter who's happy and healthy and has children of her own, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any man can really ask for. But I think about all the people who didn't make it, who died on the trail or froze in those terrible winters, or got killed in the violence that was just part of life back then. And I wonder why I'm the one who got to grow old and tell the story. There's no answer to that question. I know there isn't, but I ask it anyway. The young people today, my grandchildren and their friends, they look at me sometimes like I'm a relic from another age, which I suppose I am. And they ask me what it was like back then, what the Old West was really like, and I never quite know what to tell them. It wasn't like the movies make it out to be. Wasn't all cowboys and Indians and shootouts at high noon, but it wasn't all noble either. Wasn't all brave men taming a savage land. It was mostly just hard work and fear, and trying to hold on to what you'd built, against a world that seemed determined to take it away from you. It was watching friends die and burying family members, and making choices you weren't sure were right, but making them anyway because you had to make some choice, and standing still wasn't an option. It was beautiful too, sometimes the kind of beauty that takes your breath away, those endless prairies and mountain sunsets, and night skies so full of stars, it felt like you could reach up and touch them. It was all of that together, the good and the bad and the ugly, and it made us who we are, made this country what it is, for better or worse. I don't know how much longer I've got. Could be a year or could be 10, but I wanted to tell this story while I still could, while the memories are still clear enough to put into words. Because pretty soon, there won't be anyone left who remembers what it was like before the fences and the highways and the electric lights. Won't be anyone who can tell you what it felt like to stand on that empty prairie in 1865 and know that everything you saw for miles in every direction was yours, if you were strong enough and stubborn enough to hold it. That world is gone. We're the last ones who knew it. And when we're gone, it'll be nothing but history books and old photographs and stories that get less true every time they're told. So I'm telling it now, telling it as true as I can remember, so that maybe somebody 50 years from now, or 100 years from now, will hear it and understand, just for a moment, what it was really like.